Good morning, everyone.
Good morning, Rabbi.
We're learning Mishna Beitza, Parak Aleph, Chapter 1, Mishnah Ches, Mishnah 8. Okay, so now we're going to be talking about the malacha, the act of birer, selecting, which means separating waste from food, or any unwanted items from wanted items. And we're talking about doing it on Yontif. So, habirer kitnis b'yomtiv, one who is selecting kitnis. Kitnis is related to kitnias, legumes, such as beans or peas, and he is selecting them from their shells, husks, or other waste that get mixed into them on Yontif. Beis Shammai say, how do you do it on Yontif? Boirer oichel v'oichel. He must select the edible food from the waste with his hand and eat it right away. That's the way to read it. That's the way to read these three words. Boirer oichel v'oichel. He has to select the food from the waste with his hand and eat it right away. Beis Hillel say, Beirer kedarkai. You can select it in the regular way that you always do it. Becheikai, bekanru v'tamchoi. Just could translate the words right now, which means with a becheikai on his lap, bekina with a funnel, betamchoi, or by using a plate. Okay, so let's step back for a second. The argument over here is going to be whether the malacha, whether the act of birer, which we know, which is selecting food from the waste, that's a malacha on Shabbos. You're not allowed to do that on Shabbos. However, if three conditions are met, then you would be able to do an act of selecting on Shabbos. And that is, if you select the food from the waste, you do it with your hand, not with a selecting utensil, and you do it for immediate use to eat it right away, then we don't see that anymore as an act of birer, as an act of selecting. It's considered derech achila. It's considered part of the eating process. That's how on Shabbos you'd be able to do an act of selecting. Now, the question is, how about on Yontif? Is Yontif different? So Beis Shammai say no difference. Difference between Yontif and between Shabbos. And therefore, if you're going to be birer these legumes on Yontif, you've got to do it. Let's say you do it on, you'd have to do it on Shabbos. You'd have to do it. You'd have to take birer oichel. You'd have to select the food from the waste, or what you want for what you don't want. You'd have to do it with your hand, or with something that can be considered an extension of your hand, and you have to do it eating it right away. And that's what Beis Shammai say you got to do when you're selecting when you're trying to be birer or trying to select the legumes from the waste. That's how you got to do it. Beis Hillel say, Beirer kedarkai. You can be birer in the regular way. There is no problem being birer on Yontif. And the way they explain it here in the notes, Beis Hillel hold that since selecting shells from legumes is usually done on the very day legumes are eaten, it is permitted on Yontif. So it's tzarech eichel nefesh. It's considered a food preparation. That's number one. And also it's something that is typically done on the day that it's eaten, not the day before. And therefore, selecting on Yontif when selecting on Yontif, it's not necessary to meet the three conditions that you would have to do on Shabbos. Rather, one is allowed to take the waste from the food using a kli, using a utensil, a tool, and even if you're not intending to eat it right away, you're intending to use it for later on in the day. Now, when Beis Hillel say what you can do, they say, Beirer kedarka, you birer it regularly, becheikai, which means on your lap. The way they explain that means that by putting the mixture in a sheet on his lap and tilting the sheet so that the round legumes roll away from the waste. That's how they did it in those days. There was some kind of a sheet that they used for doing this, and that was, I'm assuming that my understanding is that would be considered the kli, the utensil that you would regularly use, and that's what you can even use on Yontif. A kanain is called a funnel, so that legumes which are smaller than the waist fall through the narrow end of the funnel. Again, you're using a kli, you're using a utensil for selecting. They explain it like this, or by putting the mixture onto a plate and gently shaking it so that the round legumes roll off. That's how it's done. That's how you usually do it, and this would be considered on Shabbos birer. But on Yontif, since you can do it on Yontif, it is not. This is what you can do without having to fulfill the three conditions meant before. And again, my understanding here is that what you're doing here at the very least is you're using a kli, which again on Shabbos you wouldn't be able to use. Okay, so that's Beis Hillel, but Beis Hillel has an exception. V'loi b'tavla, v'loi b'nafa, v'loi b'kfara. But even Beis Hillel say you may not use, to separate the mixture, you may not place the mixture onto a tavla. A tavla is a large board, which I explained, you gently tilt the board so that the round legumes fall off. Okay, or to use a nafa or a kvara. They explain a nafa as a fine strainer, which has small holes in its netting, or in a coarse strainer, whose holes are larger. Those things in the Beis Hillel say you can't use. Why? Because a large board and a strainer are used for selecting large quantities. Therefore, you may still forbid a person to use them on yontif. Meaning, even if you're going to be bayrer and be bayrer b'kli, and you even use a utensil, it cannot be the kind of utensil that you typically use for selecting large amounts. What you want to select for yontif is what you want to, it's an amount, it's a small amount, right? It's a small amount that you'll need. If not using it now, you can use it later. I mean, it's got to be for the same day, right? You can't do one thing for the other day on yontif. So we're talking about doing a small amount, a regular amount, a household amount, let's call it. But if you're talking about using a tavla, using these other things like this large board or the strainer, that is usually used for selecting large quantities, large amounts. And that you cannot do on yontif, even if you want to do it for a smaller amount. And they bring here from the Taisus yontif, the reason being because it appears as if he is selecting food to be eaten after yontif, which is prohibited. Like, why are you selecting so much now? Or it looks like you're selecting so much. Now, it could actually be that you're not. But by using that kind of a utensil that you typically use for selecting a lot, that may give the impression that you're doing for what you don't need on yontif. And therefore, Beis Hillel say you cannot use that kind of utensil. But Gamliel says, Af mediach v'shoila. Gamliel says you can go as far as doing the following. Mediach v'shoila means you would actually put the legumes and waste, and you take the legumes and the waste, the whole mixture, put it in a bowl, pour water on top of it, which causes the waste, which is allowed to float to the top, and then you skim off the waste from the top. But Gamliel say that you can even do that. Now that kind of method is like considered the most absolute bayra you could possibly do. And they explain, although this method of selecting was used for large. Okay, now what was the issue with this method? The way they explain it is that this method was typically used for large quantities. That's how you selected large quantities. Now you're using a small quantity, but that's the manner of how you do large quantities. Rabbi Gamliel holds that even though this is the method that was used for large quantities, which is the way you do it during the week, Rabbi Gamliel still is permitted on yontif for small quantities. Rabbi Gamliel is the most lenient. He says you're doing bayra on yontif, you can do it. You can even do it in a method that would typically be used for large quantities. As long as you're doing it for a small quantity, you can even do that method on yontif. That's where Rabbi Gamliel is the most lenient. Beis Hillel said you can't use the kinds of things used for large quantities, even for a small quantity. Gamliel says you could. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you, Rabbi.
So, and